you always see what you're showing, and I don't see it right now.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And it looks
Yeah.
appropriate, like there's not a bunch of notes or anything.
I don't know where
No,
that
all
is in
good.
Teams.
All good.
Doesn't seem as obvious that this is what that everyone's looking at.
Okay, you know what? Let's jump in because I know there's people who need to leave promptly at 1. So let's dive in. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Like I said, there'll probably be a few others who pop in over the next few minutes. Thanks everyone for joining. We're fortunate to have today's guests. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a moment. But before we dive in, I do want to acknowledge that we're coming together in the unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Pesco-Demukadi peoples. These several nations hold inherent rights as the original peoples of these lands, and we each carry collective obligations under the peace and friendship treaties to support the ongoing work that's happening to address systemic inequalities, both affecting the Maritimes but also across Canada. I also want to acknowledge the African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched this part of Mi'kma'ki, known as Nova Scotia, for over 400 years. I'm so pleased to have today's guests. The paper that they're going to be talking about today is a paper that I have enjoyed reading, that I felt validated in reading, and it's a really well-written paper, and I invited them to come today to speak both about the content of the paper, but also the process that they went through in putting together this paper. So I'm going to turn it over to Sandra and Renata, and I'll have you both introduce yourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm happy to see everyone joining here today. It's always the best compliment and feedback from a reader that something that I wrote connected to them personally, and that that I was able to capture that. And I forget the order of things. I think, oh, the slides have gone from view. There's now a desktop of mountains. Okay. We could go through maybe the conflicts of interest slide, Renata, and then if you want to take over. I assume you've all seen the bio, but Sarah, you could tell me for expectations if it's worth going through any kind of background.
Good. And if you want to share a little bit about, I don't know if folks saw your bios, but so if you want to tell just, a little bit about yourselves, that might help just kind of orient folks. But yeah, whatever works for you.
Okay, then just really quickly, Renata and I are colleagues and friends at Merit, which is a research center at McMaster University. My main focus is clinical reasoning, but I also drawn into sort of these interesting stories that seem to fall between the cracks in this paper, and I'll share the story for the inspiration from that in a bit. But this paper was one of those moments where there were discussions about gender equity in an academic space, and then someone said something that was like, oh, I don't know that they've considered that particular barrier, and I think that's good. That's it for me. So, I have a PhD in cognitive psychology. So that's the lens I come to this with, is I'm always wondering what people were thinking when they said something, and what drove them to say the things they did and do the things they did. So go ahead, Renata.
And I'm Renata Kelke. Sandra and I are coming to you from McMaster, where we're on the territory of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee First Nations under the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which means that we are all sharing from the same bowl and with the same spoon. So we try to manage our contributions and what we take. And I think this presentation doesn't relate directly to Indigenous ways of knowing, but it is about justice and inclusion, which I think directly connects to some of the conversations around Dish with One Spoon Agreement. So I'm Renata Kelke. I am a primarily qualitative researcher who's kind of dabbling or learning about and even moving the field forward in the area of qualitative styles of knowledge syntheses. So like big Q constructivist type qualitative knowledge syntheses, which feels very, very exciting, and it's what I'm bringing to this. I'm also a feminist and have always been. So the topic itself has been very interesting to me. Do you want to go forward, Sandra?
Sorry. So Renata and I sort of look back at the story in the paper, and as Sarah kind of pointed out, there's that maybe most of you would be interested in some of the methods and the process that we walked through to get to the narrative that we did. So we drafted these learning objectives for today. Hopefully we do manage to get through all of them. But we will share our own critiques in terms of the explanations that are normally given, often given to explain the disparity between men and women when it comes to academic medicine achievement. And we, in the paper, have identified some concrete barriers to women's advancement in academic medicine. And I think we will touch on some of those as well. In the paper, the purpose was to actually uncover some of the implicit, like implicit to maybe others, people that don't identify as having these gendered spaces that are typically assigned to women. And we touch on strengths and weaknesses of the popular strategies, recommendations that scholars offer to close the gender gap. And I wanted us to maybe have some time to discuss some review methodologies. The paper that we're talking about today is a critical review methodology. There's a little bit of creativity within it in terms of how we built the story and the research questions, and hopefully we get to unpack that for you. And in doing so, justify the method that we chose to tell the story. And this was, I guess this was me. This is where I tell the story, right? Okay. Apologies. I should have pulled up the slides myself, but because I'm not seeing presenter view, I'm losing the prompt. So I may do this often every time there's a slide popping up. Just bear with me. So this poster, I think, represents a popular message, one of encouragement, one of empowerment for women, reminding them that they're strong, and kind of indicating that, women, we can do it, and maybe we can do it all. And therefore we should be doing it, whatever that is. So in the context of we should be leaders in academic medicine, we should be keynote speakers in academic medicine, I think rolling up our sleeves and just doing that is in our power, I think is what this message conveys. And I think just for, what's the word? Etiquette. I'm totally okay with people like interrupting and asking questions, but also please put in the chat if you disagree or you have a comment or anything like that. If there's something else that you see in this poster, I'd love to hear about that. But the inspiration for the paper came from a discussion, a social conversation following a conference, the opening day speaker event at the former Canadian Conference in Medical Education. And the topic of the disappointment, like everyone was sharing their perspectives on being disappointed that there was, I think, yet again, a panel of mostly men on stage invited to be the experts on a topic. And at the table were 2 men and 3 women, and sort of everyone was sharing, the challenges of trying to change that culture and try to change that that model and change that pattern. And one of the people that I work very closely with and consider a friend, one of the men that was at the table and actually has been a sponsor of myself, putting me forward for awards and opportunities and leadership at here at McMaster, shared a story about needing to find a keynote speaker for a clinical conference that they were asked to help organize. And they commented on how they thought this would be the most straightforward task to ensure that there was a woman expert, at least not the standard stereotypical man, showcased on stage as the keynote and to highlight all their accomplishments. And he knew exactly who that was going to be and sent off an invitation. And she said no. And he thought, well, okay, no problem. You know, I think there were maybe 2 or 3 others that were considered leaders and were also women. Like, this field just seemed to be led by a lot of amazing women scholars. And one by one, they said no. And then he was faced with an internal struggle of what to do next, which is, well, I have to invite the men that I know that work in this field. But he was very concerned about the optics of that. And I think that was that moment for me where there was this gap in this narrative, this discussion, the discourse about what women can do, should do, or empowered to do for themselves. And what I realized in that moment was he probably didn't ask in the right way. And so those were some of the questions that he was, that were presented to him from the women at the table is, like, how did you invite her? And he said, oh, it was very formal and, like, you know, with respect, and like, acknowledged all of her accomplishments, and like, it was like, very respectful. And I noted, like, all the things that she had done. And, you know, we all sort of looked at each other and like, yeah, that's like, here are the reasons why we would dismiss that, right? And we wouldn't think that that's genuine. And then this was the key question that sort of unlocked this, at least for me, which was, if you had to invite the men that were experts in this field, how would you have done that? And he said, well, okay, I'm friends with most of them. I probably would have just called them up and said, like, hey, there's this conference that's happening, and like, would you be interested? And that's how the conversation continued from there, which is, well, you know, why did you choose to use different approaches? Clearly he wasn't friends with the women experts that he wanted to invite, or that he wanted to showcase, and he his approach landed as disingenuous. And so, you know, it wasn't for lack of effort. It was clearly a lack of knowledge and skill in managing this.
Yeah, and that kind of, like, very practical impetus is often the starting place for critical reviews. So Sandra had this great story, and we wanted to, first of all, parse, like, the reasons that existed in the in the theoretical and empirical literature about, from different disciplines, on why women's advancement is stalled for this problem and others. And I'm sure many of you are aware of the longstanding discourse that women should lean in, which is kind of what this poster, which I think is from is a World War II era Rosie Revere poster. So a longstanding tradition of, like, asking women to lean in, to stand up, to do it, to change or secure their own advancement. Other efforts have relied on educating men and women about gender discrimination. So if you know that it's a thing, maybe you can make it disappear. And then most promisingly, there's a lot of push, especially recently, towards ensuring that men and women can perform as allies and support women's advancement, among other issues. However, most of these efforts have not addressed the whole problem. Often there's a conversation about this, like, pipeline, that as more women enter the field, as more minorities enter the field, they'll slowly advance. But that's just not the case. And people point to this idea in many different equity-related fields of the leaky pipeline, that people might enter the field, but they're not advanced at the same rate. So that tells us that there's still a problem, that these discourses of leaning in, of allyship, and of, like, education around disparities have not solved the problem. In addition, pressuring women to lean in and take up the cause has not been sufficient, but it's also been problematic in that it puts it on people who are already lacking access by definition to power to solve the problem through power that they don't have. Which is a lot of pressure on women and makes them responsible for their own, the barriers that are created by a system that's helping someone else. Educating everyone on the existence of gender disparities is also very unlikely to lead to change. And Sandra, with her cog psych background, will tell you many things about why these interventions don't work very well. So all of these strategies that have been used, we kind of parsed and found that they didn't really address the issue in general. And they certainly didn't address that issue related to women's advancement or why women might say no. So it's not just about inviting women, it's about making sure we remove the barriers that are preventing them from saying yes. So, sorry, I've got multiple screens going on here. So we had a few questions that we wanted to answer. One of them was, why might women have less time for career advancement opportunities? So why might women be saying no for a plethora of reasons to the type of quandary that Sandra was coming up against? Why might women have less time for research and leadership, knowing that that's a barrier for us in our research team? And then we also wanted to know how these disparities are maintained. So what are the structures that are keeping things the way they are? And this is where we're kind of trying to weave together two sets of learning objectives. So hopefully it will come out in a way that's sensible. We're trying to tell you a little bit more than we normally would about critical reviews and the process of doing one, why we chose it. But we're also trying to tell you about the results of this critical review that we did. So I'll try to disentangle those as we go. You might be familiar with this framework. You probably mostly know Anna McLeod as a Dalhousie central figure. But this is a framework for thinking about different review types that she, among other people, has put together. And what it does is kind of look at the paradigms that are informing different kinds of reviews. Those objectivist type ones are really about kind of finding out what the truth is, like what is the literature saying about this problem? And the social reality or subjectivist ones are more narrative in nature and involve more individual subjectivity. So I think you can tell from the way that we were telling the story in the beginning that we're coming from a place of very practical interest. There's a problem here in practice and in the literature that hasn't really been addressed, at least in the field of academic medicine. So we wanted to try to understand where we could get more information, theoretical frameworks, to try to make sense of the problem. And there's a bunch of different, on this slide, types of narrative reviews available. The ones we considered, I've done integrative reviews before, so that would have been a potential option for us if we wanted to look at the different theories that would explain this and integrate them into a model that would help us understand it. Another option we considered at one point, I think, was a meta-narrative review, which is about telling the story of a field or idea. So what's the historical story about how the conversation around women's advancement and barriers to their success has evolved? But what we landed on was a more subjective critical review type of approach to knowledge synthesis. And this is from a paper that I contributed to the Litrex site. Have you shared that before, Sarah?
I have, and we can share it again.
Yeah, maybe do, because I think there's a lot of good resources for a number of review types. And I think that the model that I had in the previous slide, that paper is also on there, in addition to the reference being on my slide. So what I wanted to highlight about this diagram, which is from one of the two papers we published on the topic, is that central emphasis on the research team. So what a critical review methodology let us do was use our own voices and experiences to unpack a problem. It was very much about understanding our own subjectivities and how we were making decisions in the research process about what was important, about what reflected our own experience, and we were making decisions using our methodological and theoretical lenses. So Sandra was bringing in some lenses from cognitive psychology. I was interested in sociocultural theory and how that might look. And then our third team member, Teresa Chan, was bringing in her experience from academic medicine and her perspective as a woman of color who's in a leadership opportunity or leadership role at the time and currently. So it let us use ourselves in a way that felt very comfortable for a big Q qualitative researcher like me, and maybe less comfortable for other people. But it did really feel right as women at different career stages who were experiencing these exact type of problems. As I said, it also let us draw on the research frameworks that we understood and knew. Often critical reviews will bring in theories and ideas from other fields to try to inform what we know related to this problem and in this context. And the last thing critical reviews often or always, maybe always do, is focus on making specific kinds of recommendations. And these recommendations are often about how the field should think about the problem going forward. So how can we re-theorize how we're thinking about it, because we've hit a stopping point and it's just not moving forward anymore. So how can we use new theory or ideas or conceptual models to understand the problem? And then they often also have very practical recommendations. So I think we tried to do both in this paper. One was advanced theory and thinking about why women might say no. But the other one was to offer some very practical advice around how allies can help women or help remove structural barriers that prevent women from saying yes. In this slide, I was just going to tell you a little bit more about us. I think we've maybe said enough about that already, that we come from very specific disciplinary, theoretical, and lived experience types of places. I'm an early career researcher and also a mom of 2 very small children who are 2 and 6. So I'm experiencing like one end of this research continuum where many of the barriers that I face around advancement are related to travel and time, like so much to time. Sandra has had that experience, but now is a mom to older children and has different kinds of barriers when she tries to engage in advancement of leadership. And Sandra and Teresa are both women of color. I'm a white person. So I think that too influences our perspectives on this problem. And as I mentioned before, Teresa's involvement with leadership and as a clinician, I think really was absolutely necessary when Sandra and I are so theoretical and might have had trouble making our thinking applicable to people who are in clinical practice.
And maybe just before you get into this slide, I think maybe going back to like the tale I told, and Teresa Chan was at that table with me. And so I do remember us taking sort of a cab ride back to our hotel and just debating, like, and it was like, why women say no? That was the short title for this argument. And, what was really getting under my skin was all the deficit-based approaches to the arguments, which I think in my head, I could just envision all of the, women are demure, or like they're told not to stand up for themselves or be assertive, or they're not going to go and take that opportunity. So you have to give it to them, or, they're just not noticed enough. And that completely ignores all the extra work that they normally are required, expected, have to take for like to advance learners and research and other things. So yeah, that frustration just carried us, I think, through like probably a 30-minute ride. Unfortunately, it took maybe another 5 years to find Renata to finish up this, to build this story. And so I wanted to comment on how the critical review methodology that Renata had, the scholarship around it, and wanting to teach this methodology and sort of share that knowledge with their community was just perfectly suited to this, because I had a message I wanted to get out, and Teresa and I had created an argument that needed a platform, and it really was beneficial and lovely to have Renata, guide me through a structured, rigorous process to kind of uncover that message through the literature.
I think there were maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Oh no, the chat is me.
But there's some accidental or on purpose hands raised. Sarah's was one of them, but they came down.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm gonna hold on to my question. I think there's another one that I'll.
Yeah, is it okay if I share like my experience, because I'm finding this super interesting and engaging. So my name's Maya. I'm a clinician. I'm a geriatrician. I also have 2 small kids, 2 and 5. And my spouse, he is a professor at Dalhousie. And so for our family, it was really helpful actually to have a partner in academia, because they had a lot more protected time for parental leave. But I actually found it really interesting. We've made progress progress in supporting parental leave, I think at an institutional level, but I was really frustrated by the expectations for my male spouse when he was on leave. He still had a lot of work coming his way, and I think there was the thought that because he's not, nursing the baby or things like that, that he should still be able to engage. And this indirectly impacted me because then there's the thought that, well, mom will step in while he can, go to the thesis defense for the student that he was supervising. And so it's just so interesting to me how we can make some progress, but there's still a lot of expectations that create barriers, and and then I question the degree of progress that has been made, which I think is kind of coming back to the whole thesis here. Anyway, thanks
Yeah.
for letting me share that.
Thank you. So on topic. Because I think the next thing we want to talk about was really like how saying yes to something is always saying no to something else. And that was, I think, maybe the central finding to the whole review is that women are navigating different sets of responsibilities, whether they choose them or not. So women are often saddled with or accept wholeheartedly roles like those related to parenting that don't get recognized in the same way that keynotes, leadership positions, and presenting on panels might be. And when we accept those often like very socially important obligations, we don't have time for the keynotes often. And then, so there's that side, that there's things that women are doing that prevent us from doing other things. But then the other part is that men are not taking on that labor, right? And the kinds of labor we're talking about are ghost mentorship, right? Women are taking on mentorship of students left behind disproportionately to men. Women are taking on like roles in which they're the social glue of spaces. We're being looked at to potentially manage our community refrigerators in a way that men are not. And those things don't tend to be valued in the way that men's roles are, even if they're recognized at all. So
Can I just,
yeah.
Can I just add to, so thank you. Also, I wanted to thank Maya for sharing that. Again, I always feel rewarded when sort of like getting feedback about how we're connecting with people that are learning about our story or our message or a critique of things. And like the other side of what you were pointing out, like, so there is time for parental leave, but there's no clear guidelines on what is, like, there's labor laws that say that you can't ask those people to do work. But then, the people in charge of whether they ask you for work or not don't necessarily have the training as to like explicitly like, no, don't do that. Don't just assume that's just an email, or don't assume any of those things, because if they're on leave, they're there to do something else. And something that women may experience perhaps more than men is that even if they get that protected parental leave away from work and they're able to focus on things outside of that academic space, now they've had many months, up to 12 perhaps, of being away from it where you haven't engaged in that. And so you may have had a grant that was just sort of like left running without you. And maybe you did just have to work because like there wasn't enough time to put everything in place, or coming back just means you have to now remind yourself what you were supposed to be doing when you left. So that's the other side of it, is there's not enough, like just in discussing this amongst our other team, is like there's not enough allowance for like the runway back on, right? So there's sort of like the petering off. So you're going to get ready to leave, which is extra work, because now you're cramming everything in so that you could end it. Then you're off, and then there's like this, like how long that runway is going to be different for people, and not a lot of acknowledgement that is time that people and support that's needed. I think you're being asked what community refrigerator means, Renata.
Oh, I don't see the chat right now. Oh, like some people, we have a little refrigerator in our office. I've never seen a man clean it out. Yeah. And that is a very common example of things like that happen. But is also directly related to my next point, which is that the assumption tends to be, why don't women stop doing those things and do the things instead that will accrue them more accolades or power or set them up for leadership responsibilities? I think that's like really the crux of the problem. Like, why don't we just change things around entirely? Why don't men start doing more socially related stuff? Why don't women start doing less? So I think what we really needed to do was theorize like how men and women's roles are historically entrenched and how these forms of labor are reproduced. We also want to acknowledge, though, like we are really setting up a binary, and that is how the literature is structured. And I think to some extent it is useful. Women are doing more labor that's socially related, full stop, that's caregiving related, full stop. But also men and women have different kinds of experiences, and their experiences are going to be very different in terms of their intersectional roles. Like a very classic example of the conversation around white women's feminism when we were looking for the right to work in the 1950s, maybe, is that advocacy and that white women-oriented feminism, white feminism, never really resonated for a lot of Black women who were already working because of some of the other like social and financial implications because of their race. So I think we want to acknowledge that that's true, even though it's not central to our analysis. Okay, so that's kind of the setup and where we left the problem until Sandra decided on a theoretical lens to help us understand how these gendered roles become entrenched.
Yeah, so I kind of put in the chat as a foreshadowing of the literature review and what the findings kind of were strongly communicating. So we did have specific questions that led the critical review process. Being a cognitive psychologist, I think also just my nature. I will just follow a clue or a cue down every rabbit hole until I can like confirm assumptions that I'm holding, explanations that I want to validate. And so we did end up checking in with literature from psychology and sociology and business. I think, Harvard Business Review was in there. There was a book I was reading at the time about invisible women that unpacked a whole bunch of historical and like systemic ways in which women's perspectives are ignored, not consulted, or just even cultural assumptions that men often might make, and then women get sort of blamed for not responding in the ways that they expect, and so communication challenges as well, and the different socializations that men have from early on, the messages that they get to that they're a leader, like that kind of voice in your head from a young age has a very strong influence later on, and maybe hearing different voices for women when they're young and being told how they're expected to behave, what responsibilities are supposed to be theirs, and then also what they get rewarded for doing. So, I could imagine, well, for me, rather, I'll just speak from my own experience. It is rewarding to work with someone as a ghost mentor and to see them succeed. And it's not always rewarding to do those leadership things or like those admin things. I don't personally experience, a lot of institutional like reward for the efforts that I put in. And I do sometimes feel like I'm invisible, whereas other people are talked about and their contributions to committees and meetings and like their leadership roles, they're sort of talked about around me. And I mean, maybe I'm not at the tables where people talk about what I do to contribute at those committees, but it just doesn't come back to me in the same way as working with a learner, who's struggling and finally someone's actually paying attention to them. And then you actually have helped graduate or advance a learner, which is like, that's the whole business of academic institutions, right? So I'm actually contributing meaningfully in that way to what we're supposed to be doing. And so telling the story of the different kinds of stereotypes that are often end up getting translated as our fault, right? So we do these things because we have imposter syndrome. We just don't believe in ourselves, or and so we're holding ourselves back, which is very different than absorbing those messages from media and your family and your peers, and then to have it even more strengthened in an academic and certainly in academic medicine context, to have those implicit and explicit messages sometimes thrown at you. It doesn't, it's very insulting to then kind of say, well, you just need to believe in yourself and everything will be better. I know the font on this slide is a little blurry, but this is one of the infographics from the paper. So, if you have, I think you have the link to that for the event from today. But in the search through the literature, one of the questions we did ask was about the ways in which women do find support, the ways in which women succeed, and then more practical and meaningful ways that allies could step up, or sponsors, or people that our near peers could support their women colleagues. And we took the perspectives of like different leadership roles in academic medicine. So someone who's the chair of the department, someone who might be leading a research unit, and like going back to that conference organizer story. And so we put in our, these are all evidence-based summaries, the bullet points. And some of it included things we'd actually tried, but a lot taken from the literature that we pulled to also explain how stereotypes and socialization were contributing to everything, particularly the gender gap.
And I was hoping to point out a couple of dimensions with respect to the kinds of recommendations that we made and that I think are worth thinking about. Is that some of them are happening at the level of systems, like how do we change policies and practices to be more inviting to women and to remove barriers to advancement. But some of them need to really be at the level of the individual, because different intersectionalities will, and just different people will mean that we need different kinds of support. Because I think, like for me, my intersection between mother and academic and woman is a pretty key set of roles that mean particular things in terms of what's getting in my way. So there's that dynamic between like system and individual and the interplay between the two. And I think both are super critical in terms of meaningfully supporting women. But the other one I wanted to mention is that some of the barriers we've talked about, or like time costs, are personal. So like time costs involved in my personal life that drain my capacity at work. And some of them are institutional. And this slide really focuses on the at-work things. What are the mentorship and social coordinating and advising type roles that women do that men don't? Clearly, the institution has responsibility for mediating that differential effect. But I think what we haven't really talked well about is the extent to which the individual or the institution has a responsibility for mediating the effect of the labor that we're doing outside of the workplace if the institution really meaningfully values diversity. So I think that kind of is something that I wanted to invite you to think about and make your own perspective on how that could look. And that's the end of our slides. We had 2 ideas about what we could do with the remaining time. We're hoping to have like maybe even a little bit more time than this for discussion, but classically we talked more than we thought we would. And one of them was, if you want, we could play out this scenario and have a conversation about how you would add to the list of potential things that you could do to support women from these different perspectives. Or we could just have a more general conversation about critical reviews and or women's advancement. And I'm not going to direct it, so I'm just going to leave it open to the group and let you respond in the chat or with your hand up. And it will go whichever way it goes.
I don't know if Andrea is still here, but thank you. Thank you for joining.
Yeah,
And
no,
thanks
this
for
is
your
great.
comment.
This is awesome. I'm gonna maybe start by just opening it up to see if anyone just has any general questions, be it about the methodology that Sandra and Renata used, or about the findings and kind of some of the topics that they've brought up. And then we can and then I think playing through a scenario or a couple scenarios might actually be quite valuable, to be honest. Yeah, first, any questions for our presenters? Go ahead, Lara.
Hi, sorry I missed the beginning of the session. I'm out here in clinic today and things ran over a bit. So yeah, it's interesting to reflect on you know, how women's academic careers are impacted sort of across the span. My children are all grown up now, so it's certainly not an issue anymore for me. I have a bit of a sense, though, that some of the things that happened earlier in my career, like the amount of time it kind of took me to get going. I mean, I'm not complaining. You know, I'm a professor now, and I've done reasonably well. But I kind of feel like for a 56-year-old woman, that a 56-year-old man would have been further ahead. And I don't know if you ever catch up, you know, like that's one of the things that I think about, like, you know, if you're not a department head by 60 and you're a woman, like, are the gaps that happened earlier in your career, or is that too simple, right? Like, is it, you know, I don't know.
Thank you for that reflection.
Go
Sorry, I was looking at Renata's face, but I think I just beat her. I definitely share that. I think, you know, there's that challenge of like, what do you define as success? Balancing that with what you think society might define as your success. And, you know, considering all of the things that might have, you know, affected your pathway and like to lead you to where you are today. One of the issues is, again, thinking of the ways we socialize to like what is an accomplishment. So even within like promotion and tenure processes, there's still very much like the traditional values statements around how much publications and like speaker events, and that being seen as the greatest accomplishment, and usually that also being the criteria to identify a good leader. And I'll combine that with stereotypical expectations of what a good leader looks like. So, you know, it's common for most people to have this very subconscious expectation that a good leader looks like a tall, white, well-spoken man, right? And then kind of fighting against that when you meet someone that doesn't look like that or sound like that in any way. And we've all been taught to give men those like that space. Oh, you know, we know they're not good communicators. We know they don't like to talk. Whereas, you know, the flip side, and I think a lot of us, some people have shared these reflections as well, sorry, a lot of us carry around that baggage of like, well, we're going to be judged if we make people feel bad, right? And I don't know that socialization is passed on. I don't believe that socialization is passed on to men so much. It's like, think about how you're going to make people feel. There's one finding from our literature search that I'll say, and then I'll let Renata speak or anyone else, which is that with some of the emotional labor, ghost labor, and other activities that women do throw themselves into or are expected to throw themselves into, it becomes impossible to then say, like, accept an invitation to sit on the committee that's planning the conference, who might then decide which keynote speaker to invite. Right. And then that just sort of perpetuates the like less women are invited, less women get to be part of the conversation as to who or what like an expert looks like. And then less women get that practice of being on stage. And it's still very much true that women downplay their accomplishments because again, socialization tells us not to be so not to be so proud or like brag about what we've done. So it's still true that women will wait before they apply for a chair position or something like that. And women will tend to say, well, I'm not qualified. I think it's still true that on average, more men will apply to jobs that they're not qualified for. And it's all rather subconscious, I think. So, I mean, I don't have a solution, but that was sort of some of the stories we learned from the Lit Review. So I didn't mean for any of that to sound like a judgment on your career path, Laura. I don't know that you asked me a question that I was trying to answer.
Yeah.
But
No,
won't-
maybe I think, like I wondered if you spoke, and again, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning, to sort of later career women, like people who were not still at the stage where they had the young children, and about whether the choices they made, well, 20 years ago impact where they are in their careers, even in their late stages. Like that's, yeah, I guess I was just curious about that.
I think to Sandra's point, like there's an interlink between the social expectations and the actual material practices that they lead to. And by that, I mean, there's a set of social expectations for women around the kind of labor that we're going to take up. And then the actual practices where we tend to take more time off for mat leave, which is not just true, like mat leave and child rearing is a big thing, but women are taking on more labor across the continuum. Like you may be entering the sandwich generation kind of era, where then you're also caregiver for people who are older than you, people who are the same age as you and ill, or people who are younger than you and ill. So women are just doing more of that kind of labor in general. And certainly like any type of labor is that's not rewarded is a cost, right? So I don't want to say, oh, you would for sure be the dean of the world if you hadn't had kids.
Yeah.
But there's always a cost, right? And that's the point. And I think the leaky pipeline idea definitely demonstrates that women aren't systematically making it to the same levels at the same rate that men are.
And then maybe it's too late to catch up.
It's never too late. Oh, you can always lean in, right? If there's one point of this talk, that's definitely not it. But I think what we wanted to focus on also is like, what can we do for other people who have barriers in their way? And I think like there's things that Sandra does for me, knowing what it's like to have a 2-year-old because she used to have them. And they're like sometimes very microscopic practices. Like when we co-teach a course, she always does more marking than me.
Yeah.
And she never asked me to credit it.
And honestly, just to follow up on that, that is partly why I think about it, because I do see a lot of younger colleagues, and I tell them, you know, the women who are stepping back, however you want to view it, when their kids are young, and I say, just be careful, because you know, you think you can make the time up later, but you might not be able to. Like that's the thing. Like, you know, they sort of say, oh well, I'm just, you know, they're 33 or 34 when they come out of residency training. They're like, oh, I want, you know, 5 or 6 years to have my kids, get my clinical experience. Before they know it, they're 40. And it's like, you know, how do I don't want to tell them to make a decision that's wrong for them, but I don't want them to take too long to engage, because I think it does make it hard. And I look at their often male colleagues who don't look to be stepping back the same way, who are taking on positions and projects and things. And I just don't know. I just don't know if we can catch up later. Like I haven't seen women in my department. I'm a psychiatrist. I haven't seen women in my department catch up if they slowed down too much in their 30s, I would say.
I think it, like, some of the microscopic practices are around like specific women, but some of them are more systemic, right? So it's not just about like telling women not to do the labor. It's also about like giving them a bit of a tailwind when we know that they're doing that labor, right? So like it's about fixing the labor imbalance, but it's also about mediating the effects of the labor imbalance. And a specific example is coming back from mat leave. Anyone who's been on mat leave probably recognizes this problem, but anyone who hasn't might not. Is that you get the time off and you can go away for a bit, but then when you come back, everything has ground to a halt. and you're just riding a bicycle up a hill instead of like cruising on flat. And I went to my department head here at Merit and I said, this is really hard. Like, I don't have money coming in because I was away for a year and I couldn't stop the longitudinal study I was conducting. What can this look like? How can you support me in getting started again? And he sort of like managed the expectations around how I published for that year at least. And he also offered me additional research assistant support. So like that for me is a very concrete way to produce a tailwind to give women a push after they've done that social or like emotional or caregiving type of labor. Sandra looks like she wants to talk too.
I do, yes. Sorry. Just I think I'm getting an idea of what you are actually asking, Laura, now as well. And I think there's, sorry for like being trite a little bit, but practice makes perfect, right? There's a bit of that. So, if women are socialized or they choose to focus on a number of activities that aren't, climbing the ladder, let's say, then we end up being not as practiced at like sitting around the table and convincing people that our idea is a good one. We aren't as entrenched in like the network, the social network. We don't get to observe all the levers and like social capital and like the mannerisms. We're not in the spaces enough where we pick up on like, let's say like the dean of the school has certain like things, like that they respond well to or don't respond well to. If we're not taking those chances earlier in our career than when we may have more time because the kids are grown up, then we're at a disadvantage already. And of course, in terms of socialization, people who aren't raised to be sort of confident men, then they're already at a disadvantage as well because they're not as likely to just like take a risk and go forward and expect to land on their feet, right? I think we can all think of someone who just sort of goes through life and is like, yeah, someone's going to catch me, or like, doesn't matter if I fail, like it'll all work out in the end. And I would argue that's probably not a woman that you're thinking of. I don't know. Whether you can catch up, I would argue you absolutely can. And so that's where some of these recommendations come in. Like, so for the academic chair, don't send an email to, a senior, like late career woman saying, there's this position that's going to be posted tomorrow. I think you should apply. It always like amazes me at like the lack of planning when we know terms are time limited. We know if they're 3 or 5 years, like we can count that far forward. So why can't you, 12 months ahead of a term ending, start investing in the people around? So the person who's currently holding that position should be thinking of succession planning, right? But I think there's more of a culture of like sort of protect yourself and keep everything secret and keep everything within that existing community. But there should be more opportunities to share your knowledge and train the people around you. And the department chairs can help because they can say, here's 3 people I think you should train. And then that way, when the posting comes up, there's actually a serious competition, right? It's not just that person's friend is like the one who submitted their application. We could advocate for shared roles, right? So this benefits everyone. And I made this statement before. So like, if you think I've said it wrong, please challenge me. But the toxic masculinity, the socialization that men should be in charge, it hurts men too, right? There are people that are in our lives that we know, and Maya, your example, like I imagine your husband didn't want to just run away from you and your new child, for example, but was feeling the pressure to do things that they didn't feel, confident enough to say, well, no, I'm like, I need the family time, right? Because again, people are like, well, you're not the one nursing the child or whatever they might say. And so everyone needs to do something to challenge those assumptions and those strong stereotypes. But yeah, I think tapping people on the shoulder way in advance, actually using the calendar to plan for things, investing in the people that are there already. And so, it seems silly that a chair wouldn't want to reward you for all that you've done for the department, while you're also attending to your kids or other things. And so realizing that now that you're at a position where you could use your expertise in a more like targeted manner, actually invite you in and say, like, how can we get you there? And not just do it the day of the posting or, in an email where it's like, why don't you do this tomorrow? And that's just not something anyone can do. So man, woman, that non-binary, like queer, whatever, it's not something that any human being would feel comfortable doing. It's just like doing something completely different tomorrow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not just thinking of myself. We've never had a woman department head. Ever.
So you don't, yeah, so the lack of role models too, right? Looking around and like not necessarily identifying socially or culturally.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe this is me projecting too much on the younger women in our department, but I don't see them getting the encouragement and mentorship that will someday lead any of them to be the department head. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Like I don't see, the pipeline happening.
And I think that, like, if we're going to leave you with anything, it's that critical reviews are a very good tool for answering these kinds of questions. And the other one, I just wanted to return to the message in the chat from Laurel King, who I do not know, but I really like now. And I think it's that, like, where can we ask the question, who are we asking to do things, and what might be getting in their way? And then how can we either remove barriers or produce a tailwind that counteracts those barriers? And if we ask that in a very narrow and practical way, like, we can really do things that are meaningful either for individuals or for systems change. That's my spiel. And I just want to shout out to Laura too for that great comment.
Yeah, I'm mindful of the time, so I'm gonna, we don't have to necessarily wrap up at exactly 1, but I am mindful that people might need to leave at 1. So I'm happy to continue the conversation if anyone has any questions, but this is a huge, thank you so much, Renata and Sandra, for beginning this conversation. I know it's got me thinking about things. Yeah, we really appreciate you coming. For folks, I know Annabella shared the readings last week over email to those of you who kind of are on our listserv, and then they were also in the chat. But I do strongly encourage you to read it, to share it with colleagues of yours as well, those who are in your department, those who you work with, and hopefully it sparks some important conversation. But yes, thank you. This has been really helpful, validating, and I'm sure I'm not speaking just for myself. With that point, though, if anyone has any other questions, like, feel free to ask them, and we can stick around for a few more minutes.
Mm-hmm. Thank